All right, good evening and welcome to the McNay Art Museum. I'm Rosemary Hickman, the Sims Foundation Education Manager. This evening we are really approaching the end of our exhibition Pop America 1965 to 1975. This exhibition, which opened in October, closes this Sunday, January 13th. Pop America features nearly 100 artworks that connect through the vocabulary of pop art. And countries are represented: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Peru, Puerto Rico, and the US. We're really lucky to have with us tonight Dr. Teresa Eckmann, Associate Professor of Art History from the University of Texas at San Antonio, to introduce the work of Cuban-American artist Louise Cruz Azaceta, whom she happens to know personally. Azaceta is a painter whose work has been characterized as apocalyptic pop, and he left Cuba for New York in 1960 and then is more recently based in New Orleans. Dr. Eckmann, who specializes in modern and contemporary Latin American art, really couldn't be a more perfect guide for our exploration tonight. She draws not only from her experience and research as an academic, but also from her background in dance and visual art. She received her PhD from the University of New Mexico in Latin American Studies with a concentration in art history. She served as assistant curator of the National Hispanic Cultural Center before joining the faculty of UTSA in 2008. Many of her research and curatorial projects deal with cultural and personal connections across borders, including status, prints from Puerto Rico to San Antonio. In this exhibition, which was held at the Centro des Artes, Puerto Rican artists in the wake of Hurricane Maria, and also San Antonio-based artists reflected on the complicated and precarious nature of status. Concurrent with Pop America, Dr. Eckmann curated the first ever comprehensive retrospective of the artist Alberto Mijangos, which is also at the Centro des Artes, and she brought together over 90 works to recount the life of the first director of the Mexican Cultural Institute here in San Antonio, and an artist who really influenced a whole generation of San Antonio artists, and that also closes this Sunday. This evening's lecture is presented through the generous support of Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Eckmann is a close friend of the McNay and has frequently presented engaging lectures to our educator and docent audiences, and we're really pleased that she's with us here tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Teresa Eckmann?
Thank you so much. Wow, thank you, Rosemary, for the invitation to speak tonight. The McNay hoped actually to have the artist speak to you personally, but his time in his studio is his priority, and he also had surgery just this past Tuesday, so he's recovering from that, and tonight we send him our best wishes for a speedy recovery. It's an honor for me to have this opportunity to explore with you the early painting He Express of 1974-75 that curator Esther Gabbara selected for inclusion in this exhibition, Pop America. We'll be looking at that work closely tonight and as a springboard really for examining Azaceta's early production of the 70s and the 80s, and as a way to enter into his expression as a Cuban exile living in New York City at that time. And I will be jumping around a little bit in the timeline of his production to bring additional examples of thematic consistency married with stylistic, conceptual, and technical change. He has made it his life's work to reveal the human condition through his confident, bold creativity, working with a variety of media, purposefully and constantly shifting his approach to art making. And as I have summarized previously in a catalog essay for his 2008 solo exhibition, No Bounds, I'd like to read here that while it is true that we could recognize Azaceta's style on a slide quiz, as one art historian has pointed out. The variety, the richness, the sheer quantity of his production is unfathomable. Azaceta's vision is one teeming with pattern, with play, with pain, with frenzy. Azaceta, which is Luis's maternal name of Basque origin, is an appropriate starting place from which to consider his artistic process. Its meaning is alpha and omega, the first and last, the beginning and the end, and reflects Luis's trajectory of some 40 years, now 50 years, of art making that moves in cycles with various threads like interconnected tissue tying his body of work together, constantly appropriating from himself. His works are in dialogue with each other. A scavenger of his own imagery, he revisits and quotes past discoveries within his personal iconography to create anew. So here he is in the late 1980s in his studio in New York City, typically painting on the floor in this way, and then he continues, he puts his canvases up on the wall, and then jumping to 30 years later. Here he is in front of his studio in New Orleans, where he moved in 1992 after living 25 years or so in New York City. Alejandro Anreos titled his introductory chapter to his recent monograph. This came out a couple years ago, and it was actually the first monograph on this artist. He titled that introductory chapter on the artist, "The Painter in the Bunker," is how he titles it. And I'd like to read just the first paragraph in his introduction. He says, Anreos says, on the corner of Chupitulas Street? Good, glad you, I have to say it again so you can correct me again. In the uptown section of the city of New Orleans stands a 2-story building made of concrete. The structure looks like a bunker. It might as well be one. The main entrance door is on Street, and there are 2 garage rolling dock doors on General Taylor Street. From the outside, the blocky, crude simplicity of the building informs us that it can resist hurricanes and floods. It has. Inside the building, you hear very little of what might be going on outside. You get the feeling that you could survive the end of the world in there. In fact, the artist's life work survived Hurricane Katrina inside this windowless bunker. I want to underscore that Azaceta has lived an energetic life with a constant outpouring of work, a powerhouse of an artist. At 76, he continues his fast-paced productivity, committed to experimentation, and the marriage of aesthetics with acute, prophetic social content. And while we're focusing on his early and a few images from his mid-career today, select works from the 70s and 80s, I just wanted to make clear that Azaceta is a working artist whose art continues to evolve. He has stated any number of times that it's his hope to, quote, die with a brush in his hand, unquote. And he does have his own website. It's luiscruzazaceta-art.com, where you can browse even more of his current work. I wanted to show you, once you go in this door right here, this is the inside of his studio. This is a photograph I took in a 2008 visit. It's really his own personal gallery. It's a tremendous space. And he waited a long time to to find the right space. It's basically a warehouse. So he works in here daily, every day, and I'd like to play a short video clip from an interview with Robert Lowe that was done almost 30 years ago now, as an introduction to how this artist self-identifies. And I have to go out to this website for a second, and I'm going to make this full. It's just 1 minute, and the little box will disappear after 2 seconds. And hopefully you get used to he's got a heavy accent. You get used to it after a little bit.
I don't want to be perceived just as a Latin American artist, or for that matter, a New York artist. I want to perceive as, if I'm good, I'm good. It don't matter at the end where you come from. I think all that is kind of limitations that they put on you, labels, they want to put you indoors. That's why I'm constantly working against it. Already people expect certain things of my work, and that's why I'm constantly changing. Because I don't want to be perceived in one way. You know, I mean, I keep on living, I keep on growing as a man, as a father, as a son, as an artist, and you're constantly changing. And I think the work is changing as I'm changing. And that's the way I like to be perceived, as a man in a constant flux.
So this self-defined Cuban-American artist carved out his place in contemporary art history, not in Havana, where he was born in the borough of Marianao on April 5th, 1942, but in New York City. With a visa, he left Cuba in 1960 at the age of 18, just as he was about to be conscripted into Fidel Castro's army. And he landed in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he lived with relatives. The balsero, depicted here, the Cuban refugee who crosses the ocean in an inner tube or a makeshift raft, poorly equipped to deal with his precarious situation, became one of many important symbols that Cruz Azaceta created in the 1980s. And he was one of the first to use the balsero as a symbol. Many followed him after. Throughout his oeuvre, the artist's weathered, usually emaciated, and often disfigured portrait stands in for the everyman, representing the anguish and the struggles of the ordinary person. There is no escape from the ills of society or from the hierarchical reality of the powerful and the oppressed. As you see here, in this monumental canvas, Latin American victims of dictatorship, oppression, and death, with its message extended beyond individual pain to embody a body of oppressed peoples. This was the first work of Luis's that I saw in person. It was included in the 1994 exhibition Ante America, or Regarding America, that traveled to Center for the Arts at Yerba Buena Gardens in San Francisco, where I was working at the time. And I still can envision where it hung, very high up in the gallery. Reviewing that exhibition in Art Forum, Thomas McKevely commented that this mural-sized painting addressed, quote, political conditions and relations of dominance in the hemisphere. It is a stark and tragic image of human sacrifice, unquote. And I have an installation shot of this work hanging in another exhibition, and that it gives you a better idea of its presence within a space. It's a tremendous canvas, impactful, and often he works large scale in this way and also on unstretched canvas, as you see here. So he spoke almost no English when he arrived in the US in 1960, and he also had no art practice whatsoever. He spent his first 3 years in Hoboken working in a trophy factory for $1 an hour. and he got fired after 3 years because he was unionizing. He maintains this strong sense of justice and injustice. He commented to me, quote, "I saw ladies there working in the trophy factory. I saw ladies there working for 20 years, making $1.10 an hour. I said to my uncle, this is unfair, 20 years. These were primarily immigrants." So his ironic sense of humor comes through as he explains that he made the best of his situation and of that menial daily labor of assembling trophies by placing the occasional trophy on his dashboard, the dashboard of his car, champion bowler, first place dancer, whenever he had a date. He was trying to impress the ladies. Lou Thomas referred to this is a 12-foot canvas, as, quote, one of those paintings confronting class consciousness, where a utopian village dwells inside the perfect American car, the '59 Cadillac. And for most folks, the dream of winning lotto is nothing more than a sort of failed ownership, a substitute for ever owning their dream automobile or their dream house. This is one of the psychological stances that Azaceta takes in response to the economic frustration that is the plight of the exile, the homeless, the AIDS patient, as well as the middle-class American. And it took him a while, this is from 1989, to get to or arrive at this symbolic, figurative, monumental, popular expression that you see here. So how did he come to art? In a 1988 interview with Friedhelm Menekes, Azaceta recalls that after being fired from that trophy factory, he says, quote, "I spent an entire month," and he says he went to see a movie every day for 30 days, but "I spent an entire month during the winter looking for a new job, and out of boredom, I began to draw. I went to an art supply shop, and I bought some crayons, some paper, and I began drawing still lives. And that was back in 1963, he says. I'll never forget that day. I was in the store buying supplies when I heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. My interest in art grew, and I started to buy books on art history, mostly the classic modern. And ever since then, it's become a fever." So he worked for another 3 years, this time in a button factory. And while he was doing that during the day, at night he was taking drawing classes at an adult education center in Queens. So further addressing this sense of identity, he states, "I feel very much Cuban. I'm Cuban, but I'm also an artist. My formation was in New York. My formation was not as an artist in Latin America. So I always consider myself to be an artist in exile. I think that there's a zone or a country that we call exile. It's neither here nor there. Perhaps it's in your own head. I think that's where I belong, in that parameter, like a hybrid in many ways. I think I have the formation of both cultures, living in Cuba for 18 years, and then all the past 30-something years living in the United States. I think that the formation of both cultures has made me who I am." In a conversation that I had with him in 2004, he referred to that space of the exile as an in-between space. He called it a head trip, a psychological trip. He saw the exile, or himself, sandwiched between two cultures, between two cities. He stated, quote, "You have no home, you are in limbo. The space of the exile is limbatic. It is not hell, and it is not really heaven. It is a weird kind of space that we live because we are not here and we're not there psychologically. We don't belong here, but we don't belong there anymore. So in 1966, he enrolls full-time at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan. This is the only image I have on the upper left hand, and I'm sorry, it's a black and white Xerox, the only image of what he was doing at that time. He became a US citizen in 1967. That was a necessity for being eligible for student loans. At School of Visual Arts, he was a formalist, hard-edged. He was confined to geometric abstraction in line with artists such as Frank Stella, who you see here, and Victor Vasarely. He studied art history with none other than Dory Ashton as his teacher. He worked part-time for many years as a clerk in the NYU library. It was a library that he recalls had over 1 million books, and he would stack them, and he would browse, and he would take art books into the bathroom and read them. He said he'd look through the pictures, preferred that to reading. And he remained at School of Visual Arts until 1969 when he graduated. He addresses his shift, it was a big shift, from geometric abstraction to a new figuration in a talk that he gave at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1989. I want to play just 1 minute of his talking about this change in his art.
In 1969, when I graduated from the School of Visual Arts, I became a master of the masking tape. These were the things that I was doing, influenced, I guess, by what was happening in New York with the state of Australia and others of this type of formalist type of works. I realized that with this kind of works that has all the components of a painting, I mean, you get a lot of forms, space, lines, textures, etc., something was missing. Not until I went to Europe, I realized that I didn't know what kind of an artist I wanted to be. By looking at Dory and Velázquez and some painters like the Prado, like it was mentioned before, I realized that I was in the wrong track. These were paintings that were personal type of paintings, and something was missing here. And what was missing, I think, was content, the human condition.
So content, the human condition, is what he says was missing from his work. And as he explained, his leap into the aggressive figuration for which he became known came after his graduation in 1969, after he got married, and he took this honeymoon trip to Europe for a month. He traveled through France, Italy, and Spain, and what really struck him were Goya's paintings, his black paintings that he saw in the Prado Museum. And as you see, an example of which is here on the far left of Saturn devouring his children from this series. He began to paint from memory, and he made no preliminary sketches for his paintings. And then he began to paint from his surrounding urban environment. The self-portrait as an everyman, as a victim, as a vehicle to comment on the human condition gained a prominent place in his work. And he worked towards building a personal iconography by considering the ills of society. And he thought art, and he continues to think this, he thought that art could be a tool to make people better. The painting He Express, that's included in Pop America in the main gallery, is part of a series called the Subway series that emerged in 1972. And it came after this. I have just one black and white from this car crash series that he did, about 20 paintings, when he's remembering this horrific car crash that he had, that his family was involved in. And then it comes before his 1980s expressionism as represented by this double self-portrait that we see on the far right. So this is a work, the work that hangs in the main gallery, and I want to listen again just for 1 minute to Azaceta explaining how he situates this work.
Well, you know, in the 70s in New York, the art world was so cool, so cerebral. So in order to work against it, I began to do kind of cartoonish type of paintings, which I think I would call an apocalyptic pop to a certain degree, with a lot of irony and using the titles, the very humorous titles, because the work was so grotesque and repulsive to a certain degree that I would compensate it with very hardcore intensity of the spectrum and also with the irony of the titles to balance out the grotesqueness of the work. And that was, like I said, in opposition to what was going on in New York. Many people told me, Luis, you're wasting your time, it's kind of passé, that kind of expressionistic type of work that you're doing, that's already being done, and blah, 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 blah. I thought that I had a great need to say things of that sort that way because I was the only way I knew how to do it.
Yeah, and he also, he comments on the importance of graffiti. Also, he explains that he did this series, and I'll show you more paintings in the series, based on graffiti. He says, because I think graffiti is done by people who want to reach the masses. They want to create a new media to reach the masses. If you go down and draw in the subway, you're doing an art the masses are bound to see. It is an act of freedom, of anonymity, but it's really based on boredom, on anarchy. Graffiti is done for the sake of making a mess out of sheer boredom. Graffiti is a very Latin thing to do, because if you have a feeling of not being free, the only way to express yourself is in an anonymous way. I don't think graffiti is art, but I think the subway, the whole subway system with the graffiti in it, is a kind of collective masterpiece, he says. So these statements from the artist begin to address what is likely our main question in this lecture, and that is, what does this painting contribute to broadening our understanding of pop? What do we know of pop? And I summarized in a previous lecture.
Well, you know, in the 70s in New York, the art
in a previous lecture for the McNay docents, I want to go back. Yes. I briefly kind of talked about how pop is typically seen as this Western phenomenon, and the names that we're familiar with, of course, are Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Robert Indiana, and less so maybe Hugo Rivera Scott of Chile, or Raúl Martínez of Cuba, although that may change with this exhibition as Pop America specifically strives to expand our knowledge of pop as a global expression. So how do we define it? How do we define pop? It is this style of painting, a style in painting and sculpture as well, that developed in the 1950s and the 60s in Britain and in the United States. And it takes its inspiration from commercial art, items of mass culture, such as comic strips, supermarket products, brand name packaging, advertising. We see all of those things in Luis's painting, He Express. He draws from all of those elements. Again, comic strips, supermarket products, brand name packaging, advertising. So at the time, art responded to this growing presence of mass media after World War II, and pop art reacted to abstract expressionism, If you think of Jackson Pollock, you think of Mark Rothko, that was the dominant style in New York in the late 40s and in the 50s. But that cold, cerebral art in the New York scene that Luis is referring to and that he says he reacted against in the 60s was specifically that of minimalism, the work of people like Donald Judd or of Stella, of course. So his apocalyptic pop is one of examining the everyday violence and also passivity that takes place in the urban landscape. He's interested in the universal theme of man as victim. To repeat, he's interested in the transformative aspects of art. He believes that art can create change, and he believes that art can evoke sympathy and compassion more than anything else in the viewer. So he's painting the intensity of his experiences in New York City specifically as an exile immigrant, and he's relating that to the political oppression and the terrorism that he experienced in Cuba, the Cuba that he left behind. So he recalled to me, and I quote, he says, "I remember being in school and a car passing by shooting and a police car chasing them. I think they were revolutionaries. We had to hit the ground, and then there were bombs exploding in the center of Havana, in the cinemas and the main stores. It was really chaotic," unquote. So his fragmented, dismembered figures represent the feeling of fragmentation that he experienced on abandoning his family, which his family eventually joined him in New York, but in abandoning his family, his country, and I believe he is yet to return to Cuba. He tried, they wouldn't give him a visa, he is yet to go back. And in abandoning his cultural roots. He denounces social problems through his imagery, but he employs humor, and he also employs shock to do so. He plays with language, as you see here. Man is meat to be consumed. Hamburgers, hot dogs. Abre, the letters abre, is in Spanish, it's the command to open. Abrir, open, abre la puerta, or something. Chico, he's playing with the word chico, which means small, and this word is repeated in other paintings. He mixes it up a little bit in another painting. It's cochino, which means grungy or dirty or pig, or chino. He also uses chino, so he plays with code switching as well in his works. I have found that his focus on our social condition to be prophetic. A writer, D. Eric Burkhart, stated in 1993 that, quote, "There are tides in the lives of men and their societies that hark to the cycles of nature, to the ebb and flow of the seas or the periodicity of seasons. The life of Luis Cruz Azaceta offers evidence of this timeless dialectic. He is an artist of profound, even psychic, sensitivity to his environment," unquote. So the echoes in these works are from 1974, 75, and 1981. So the echoes in these works to 9/11 are uncanny. And I want to read a poem that Azaceta wrote about 9/11 that was published in his exhibition brochure in December of 2001, just a few months after that tragic time in history. And I'm going to move off of this image to this, so you can also see how he shifts in his medium, in his use of medium as well. So this is his poem. A circle, a zero, a dot, a point, a bead, elements in my current work. Add 1 circle, 2 circles, 3 circles, 20, 100, thousands. Tired, drink water, sit down, wandering. The telephone rings, marketing call. Put music on the radio, classic, Mr. Piano Man. Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg Variations. Great, my favorite. I'm walking on water. More colored circles on the underpaint. Obsession, more circles, all different, small, medium, large, abstractions. Positive, negative, black, white, pattern structures, movement, geometrical, organic cells, microorganisms, nanobacteria, viruses, bugs, clusters, prayer beads, carnival beads, the Kabbalah, music, the stars, the cosmos, the brain, beauty, mystery, enigma, loud interruption, tick, 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 the radio special report, looking at the unfinished circle, half a circle, tick, 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 a plane crashed into the World Trade Center, my mouth gets dry while I'm listening, finished the incomplete circle, I sit on the rocking chair, stare at the paint. 15, 17, 20 minutes of blah, blah, blah news. Speculations? Another plane dives into the second tower. Incredible. Fiction, reality, reality, fiction. I can't believe it. Sabotage, terrorism. Can't work no more. I'm worried and perplexed. Called my son in New York. Called my sister in New York. Called my parents in New York. They're okay. My friends, still too early to know. 9:25 a.m. The buildings are on fire. Smoke, smoke, smoke. Go to the bathroom. Put water on my face. Called my wife. She is in a panic. She sees it on TV. The two buildings collapse. Terror, nightmare. Who could do this? The furies unleashed. Monstrosity, chaos. Hundreds of people trapped. Thousands dead. I can't take it. Turn the radio off while talking to my wife. Bye, see you later, go for a ride. Audubon Park, the Mississippi River, the clouds, the sky, the birds, the boats, the trees, the light, fragile life, dark life, sadness. Go back to studio, look at the work in progress, see a myriad of circles dancing and a dark ring of hell in my mind, ground zero. Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, Luis Cruz Azaceta. So this canvas taxon is one of the works that he was painting at that time, and it hung it with other such large-scale canvases in the exhibition that he titled Happy Deadly. Happy Deadly. So aesthetically, it's exquisite. There's these jewel-like, kaleidoscopic color that attest to the artist's delight in patterning. It's bright, it's cheery. It evokes the celebration of Mardi Gras in New Orleans or the brilliant colors of the shotgun houses there as well. But at the same time, the image harbors danger. As Azaceta points out, that this dance of circles also conjures a microscopic view of viruses, of nanobacterias, likely inspired by the anthrax scare at the time. So jumping back to this subway series, and I'm working at finding color images for these, but it does give us the opportunity to note that he uses heavy black outline, very purposefully, reminiscent of comic books, of course. But he states about this series, he says, New York is a very aggressive city. The thing that struck me the most when I came to the United States was the subway, the behavior of the people in the subway. In Cuba, most people talk to one another while using public transportation. And here, nobody talks to anyone. Everyone is so quiet, they just stare or they read their newspaper. Someone could get killed in front of hundreds of eyewitnesses and nobody would even lift a finger. That really struck me. It's unreal. I mean, that's not reality, is it? There's always a type of psychological paranoia in the city. Every time you turn a corner, you experience a certain fear. To be alone in the park in New York City is a fearful experience. I became aware of my mortality in New York. It's funny in a way because you don't necessarily see it, but you sure do feel it. It's all very strange, very unreal. All this began to come out in my work, and he stated that in 1988. So this is caca, or poop express, if you want to use a nice word for caca, where you have these, metro passengers represented as these cartoonesque animals, pigs and alligators. They're engrossed in their newspaper. They're oblivious to the carnage that's going on around them. Susanna Torruella Laval commented on this series. She says, anything can happen here. Alligators peer out of windows, babies are born, women strip, men stare, ice cream cones drip, Miss Subway poses, monsters read comics, someone vomits a shoe, but mostly people get hurt, seriously hurt. Rapes, shootings, hangings, fires, decapitations, even cannibalism are commonplace. So even as he painted the passivity and violence that surrounded him, the psychological state of the exile remained the thematic thread that runs through his work. In a 2004 interview that I did with Luis, he said to me, quote, "The themes through my work have basically always been the same themes: the homelessness, violence, the balseros or the refugees, death. Those are primarily the themes in my work." He says he used principally a palette of red, black, and white for the series. You see some green in there as well. And he has remarked that he took unconscious inspiration, he said, from Philip Guston at the time. Guston's work he was represented by the Alan Frumpkin Gallery, where Luis gets in, and he'll tell you that story. But he had seen Guston's work in the late 60s, and it wasn't well received, but his art history teacher, Dory Ashton, was a big defender of Guston. Azaceta also tells us that he was looking at Mad magazine at this time for inspiration. And the art historian Andreas, he says, quote, "These subways may be the circles of an urban hell, but the artist has decided to confront the horror with irreverence and laughter. The interplay of the tragic and the comic in these pictures heightens their paradoxical nature. The subway as subject became the laboratory for Cruz Azaceta to explore the human condition, a condition that he has perceived as both psychologically violent and alienating and grotesquely funny." And speaking of hell, and I'll come back to more subway images, but I wanted to interject that Azaceta's meditation of the exiles, and in turn the everyman's psychological entrapment persisted in his production, as in just two powerful examples from the late 80s and 90s. And please imagine these as his work is very large. I mean, typically these are large canvases that envelop the viewer. So on the left you have the balsero in his makeshift raft, echoing Munch's scream of utter desperation, framed by aggression. And the rain of circles, which always reminds me, I think, of the button factory where he worked in for 3 years. These circles enter into his work very frequently. On the right, you have this tiny, I don't know if you can see it, this tiny little figure here, naked figure, peering into this abyss of hell. Azaceta explained, I have a lot to say. I'll try to, wrap up a little bit. But I'm okay, right? So I have a little bit of time. Okay. So he explained his motivation. This is yet another work from the Subway series. He explained his motivation for this work to Andreas, stating that the mechanical aspects of the city, the bridges, the tunnels, the skyscrapers, but most of all the subways, affected him. He says, the subways were like a theater of the absurd on tracks. The silent passengers with their heads in their newspapers, avoiding any contact with the other travelers, even with their eyes, like automatons. The subway filled with people, yet everyone in their own world. At times it looked like cattle in a wagon on the way to the slaughterhouse, quote. So we see in this work the elements that are consistent in this series. You've got basically a window into a world. It's almost like a television set before you. In this case, the doors are open. He plays with open and closed doors, and we can see the horror that's happening inside. You've got the code switching going on with the English-Spanish. You've got loco, loca, crazy, loco, loca, local, man, woman, reference to craziness and local craziness. You've got flat surfaces, but they've also been transgressed with this splattered paint, graffitied as well. You've got the Chico tag on the right-hand side there. You've got this naked figure who is cannibalistically chewing on a severed leg that has a high heel, and it's a cutout canvas like the one like He Express in the gallery where the form emerges as a relief. It moves into our space, into the viewer space, and it offers another dimension. You've also got this other figure with his glasses askew and a severed ear up there, clothespin to a hanger. And this is a mixed media work, a drawing on paper. He made it clear to me that drawings are independent works to him. He does not do preliminary sketches. He's an incredibly confident painter. He doesn't do the sketch and then it translates into a larger work. Sketches or drawings like these are independent works on their own. And they typically come after the painting for him. A drawing or a print comes after the larger painting. Here again we see this cochino, grunge on the side. And he is using mixed media. Here's a map of the New York City Metro that he's embedded in there. So these splatters also that cover the body parts, he's referred to them as a la Seurat, is what he says. Dots that he uses, that he's looking to create some movement as the different colored dots react with one another. Actually, Andreas calls them, quote, multicolored drips that evoke a psychedelic rash, unquote. And Azaceta was living in Staten Island at the time he created this series. He was going back and forth on the train, and that's where these come out of. He also refers to these. It's so nice to see the work in the gallery and to see how how the cutouts come out, because it's hard to see on a 2D surface. But he referred to these cutout parts as looking like twisted meat to him. Do we have Spanish speakers in the audience? Some? A few? One? A few? Okay. I wanted to, it should reload. So this is in Spanish. It's only a minute, but I think it's, he's told this story. I mean, this was filmed just last June. So this is very recent, but he's told this story any number of times over the past 40 years. And it was a really an important life event for him. And the event was how he found his gallery representation in New York City as a young artist. And it wasn't just any gallery. It was the gallery. He made a list of 10 galleries. It was the first one at the top of his list. And it was Alan Frumkin's gallery on 32 East 57th Street. It was Alan Frumkin who was representing people like Joan Brown and Philip Guston and Jim Nutt of Chicago's Harry Who, Philip Pearlstein, Peter Saul also was in this gallery, and the like. But what's interesting for me about his retelling is that he actually remembers important details that he doesn't share in previous accounts of the story. And maybe it's because he tells it in Spanish. But it's just, I'll play a little bit of it, and then I'll just try to give the details of how he remembers this.
Si yo decidí en el 1974 empezar a buscar galerías. Yo me gradué en 69 de la Escuela de Arte Visual y entonces trabajé duramente buscando mi propia voz, mi propia idiosincrasia, iconografía, etcétera, etcétera. Empecé a desarrollar una serie del software, basado en el software, estilo graffiti, medio cartoonish, cartón más o menos, sin usar los stretches, los bastidores, eran pinturas enrolladas. Entonces hice una lista con 10 galerías. Empecé con Alan Fromkin, que estaba ubicado en la calle 57 del Exile, de las mejores galerías estaban más o menos en ese edificio. Y entonces me aparezco al señor Fromkin en medio de la galería, sin hacer cita ni nada de eso, con un tubo grandísimo. Y entonces él sale, cuando me vio, sale de la oficina corriendo y casi me grita, me boja de la galería. Y me dice, ¿qué es lo que usted quiere? Le dije, no, yo soy un artista y quiero mostrarle mi obra. Me dice, nosotros no hacemos eso aquí. Usted tiene que primero verme a mí con su diapositiva y si me gusta su obra, yo lo visito a su estudio. Entonces yo le dije, no, yo no sabía el procedimiento de eso, lo siento, con mucho gusto. Pero mira, yo estoy aquí, si le interesa ver la obra, con mucho gusto se la muestra. Entonces me miró de arriba abajo, me hizo ok, me trajo al cuarto adyacente a su oficina, estaba vacío, y ahí desenrollé las obras, que eran dípticas. Y entonces cuando lo hice, que puse las dos obras juntas, ¿cómo se llama? Lo llamé, y vino entonces y se asomó así, de lado así, porque una obra grande en el piso, mirando la obra, y lo veo que se sonríe. Y cuando me pregunta, ¿cuál es tu nombre? Yo dije, coño, aquí lo tengo.
So, coño, aquí lo tengo, he says. So what he's saying is that he made this list of 10 galleries. He goes to Frumkin's gallery with a giant tube of his work. He walks in the gallery, Alan Frumkin comes out, and he basically tries to throw him out of the gallery. He yells at him, and he says, well, he's very apologetic, and he says, well, I'm an artist, and I'd like to show you my work. And Frumkin says, we don't do things that way here. You have to send me your slides first, and then if I like you, I'll come visit you at your studio. And Louis says, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't understand the process, but, you know, I have my work here, and I'd love to show it to you if you'd like to see it. And so Frumkin says, okay. And he sets it up in his office. He said they were large pieces. They were actually the Subway series. I don't know if he expressed it a little bit. It's 74, 75, but this happened in 1974. And so he's in Frumkin's office, he has his work laid out, and Frumkin walks in, and he's looking at kind of sideways, and Louis says, and he smiles, and he asks me my name, and he says, at that point, I said, I got him, he wants to know my name. And literally that's what happened. He was interested in his work. He gave him a 2-person show with a sculptor, Michael Eason, and Louis very proudly says, nothing in the show sold. All of the sculptor's work sold, but he's commercial and he didn't last. And me, you know, Alan bought one work because he was sorry for me, but then he went on to show with Alan Frumkin in his Chicago gallery and his New York gallery with great success. And that's that story, his story of getting a gallery. And he went on from the Subway series to do works like this, again, still playing with the theme of violence, Bang Bang You're Dead, and still joining his experience of violence in Cuba with his experience in New York. He talks about the little dog as being a symbol for the Cuban police that were called G2s or something like that, but the dog was a reference to the Cuban police. Another work such as this, where he's talking about authority and our attempt to control society by putting up street signs like no parking at any time, and his subversion of that with this decapitated head parked there, which is also, it's a timeless image. I mean, we can look at this now at this point, and it might remind us, unfortunately, of what's been happening with the cartels. But it's also an example, and I can't help but, makes me think of these little toy things, how he's treating the eyes there. But he keeps returning to themes. So here's another work that's Do Not Die Here from 8 to 6. And here's a work from last year, 2017. His palette has changed. It's this Dayglow palette, and he's kind of returned to some of that, masking tape formalism from before. But he's treating the same theme as before. Do not kill here, anytime from noon to noon. From there, he did a series, this is still the late 70s, a series of self-portraits, and these still have a pop relationship. We can talk about, we can talk of them within pop, because he's ironically using Disney marketing on his adult head, or this lowbrow paper Burger King crown, to attack consumer society, to attack class distinctions, to question his place in his adopted country. Here's another self-portrait, and at this time his first marriage ended in a very painful divorce, and his firstborn son Emile was 2 at the time. But again, it's not specifically autobiographical. He's still talking about the everyman who is affected by the experience of urban as well as psychological violence. He got out of the city. He had several residencies starting in 1979. He just working part-time at NYU and trying to paint full-time was hard for him, and he had some help. So he took a residency and taught at UC Davis in 1980. The next year he taught in Louisiana, where he met his current wife Sharon Jacques, and they had a son together, Dylan, as well. And then this series came while he was painting, very quickly, while he was painting at UC Berkeley in 1983. So this series, Tough Ride Around the City, and the subway series were shown at Mocha at the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art on Broadway in 1986, and his work began to take off, especially in terms of how it was selling and in terms of his gaining international and national recognition. And these are large, again, these two. He's still got that shock value. He keeps shifting the scale of body parts. He put a little tiny arm paired with a larger arm, exploiting distortion and producing these disturbing, grotesque images. So he's committed to figuration. He's using the self-portrait as a springboard. He's using a heavy impasto brushwork, screaming color. He's got, in this series, man animal, man insect, man object creatures that are pierced or mutilated, disfigured, monstrous beings that fill his canvases. Here's some other images. Here, I like this because you can see the scale of it, quite large. He states that Split Head is a self-portrait head about the fragmentation of society, which we are all witnessing and experiencing. There's a lack of something in the middle to hold us together. This work, Homo Fragile, this is in the Blanton collection at UT Austin. And it synthesizes, it's from '83, but it synthesizes so much of what we've been looking at, the theme of man as meat, that he's been exploring man as victim. It's a kind of a Saint Sebastian figure, but it's also drawing from the Afro-Cuban religion in the tradition of the sacred figurative sculptures that are known as Inquisition Condi. And I saw one of these actually on the artist's mantle in his living room. So I know that reference isn't off. This is a large work from that time, Apocalypse Now or Later. And if there's a comparison to be made with Mexican muralist José Clemente Orozco, who Azaceta acknowledges as an influence, this would be the obvious comparison. This is Catharsis by Orozco. It's a monumental fresco that's painted in Mexico City's Palace of Fine Arts. And it too is Orozco's apocalyptic vision of war, which in his case he equates with prostitution. But Azaceta tells us that this is the one time he directly appropriated, and he did that from Rousseau's War. But he says that his horse looks more like a rat. And he says his is more repulsive than Rousseau's. Again, just to touch on some of his influences, because the sources of inspiration are quite varied, he has mentioned that he has an interest in Panamanian mola textiles. He also collects them. And here are some examples on the right there. And they're brilliant narrative panels that decorate the blouses of the coastal Kuna Indians that are produced by women. And they're sewn in these cutout layers in a reverse applique. And they incorporate legend, they incorporate history and contemporary events, but they're always saturated in complementary colors, and they vibrate on the optic nerve. He says that people were repulsed by his work in the 70s, but by the 80s, his work was accepted, it was digested, it was fashionable. So he changed. Just like that very first segment that I showed you, he changes. And while I was completing my PhD at the University of New Mexico, I was invited by the Blanton to write an object essay for their publication, their American art publication of their permanent collection. So they asked me to write about this piece, which is titled Sleepless. And these are my notes. I just wanted to read a brief part of what was published. So, Sleepless challenges the viewer to confront homelessness with minimal materials. This poetic visual statement conveys impermanence and discomfort. A panel suggesting a hard bed, a balsero's raft, is coated lightly with gesso, exposing the movement of the ocean's surface in the wood's grain. The artist's face, with furrowed brow and closed eyes, is drawn in charcoal and sealed with visible drips of shellac, creating stains that recall body fluids, specifically urine and blood. Twisted metal sculptural forms abstractly allude to limbs that entrap rather than support, a disembodied head. These metal studs, normally used in construction, serve as containers here. Repeated photographic images of desolation, the subway, a shotgun house in silhouette, a street person's makeshift home in Chelsea, add visual information and spatial depth. The red, white, blue colors of the latter image evoke the US and Cuban flags. The exile is caught between two cultures. The lowest receptacle holds coins, a beggar's handout. Sleepless subtly suggests paralyzing fear and anxiety. It participates in the artist's ongoing dialogue with violence and passivity, and is stylistically related to works from the Real Fiction and Oklahoma series of 1996-98 that were created in New Orleans, where Azaceta and his wife Sharon Jacques have lived since 1992. At the heart of Sleepless lies Azaceta's conviction that by awakening social awareness and responsibility, art can transform humanity. which he is quite insistent on. And that research on the artwork gave me the opportunity to visit with him and his wife, Sharon, at his studio in New Orleans in 2004 to review some of what we see, and just to conclude, some of what we see Azaceta offering the viewer in this early work in relation to pop and in terms of expanding our understanding of pop. So he examines the everyday urban situation from the point of view of the exile immigrant. He gives us the brash, expressive, arbitrary use of color. He gives us large scale to involve us in his space, a humorous view of our failings, parodic eroticism, code-switching language, drawing Spanish into the mainstream, unrelenting social criticism, and more. And I'd like to end with just with the artist's optimistic outlook. And I thought this image was interesting too, in terms of pulling together some of these ideas. So.
Maybe think it's like this, and maybe with certain humor, it becomes like a catharsis that I could, recall certain things, certain experiences I go through life. So I feel lucky that I could do things like this. There's many people out there with very frustrated that they go through experiences, negative experiences, things that go in their life, it's no way they can do anything about it. So I feel privileged. I don't hold anything back in my work. Whatever I think, I'm going to put it down. I have that freedom, and I think in this country you can exercise that freedom. It's probably the only country in the world that you can do that. So we have really to preserve it that way.
Yeah, so he talks about freedom. He says he puts something down with confidence and he leaves it there, and he's talking about freedom, and he's talking about the need to preserve that freedom. So I hope there's so much more, to talk about. But I hope that helps kind of put He Express in some context. And if you had any comments or any questions, or if there are any specific works that you'd like to go back to look at again, I think we have a couple of minutes. Anybody? Oh, and Rosemary has a microphone. If you have anything you want to add or comment.
Thank you. Well, I was curious if you knew more about the way he would approach mediums. Did he have a specific medium that he preferred to work with, or did that come in periods as well? Or could you tell us a little bit more about his materials? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I only showed you such a tiny little part of his production. He moved away. That one image of the installation, the cutouts on wood is a suggestion of where he goes. He starts to work with constructed pieces, objects, and I was trying to get back to the tower. It's not the best example, but he really branches out in terms of his medium. He goes back and forth. A painter, once a painter, always a painter. And he always said the drawing is the foundation. Drawing is very important to him. But especially and I really didn't get to touch on the fact that he's treated so many events that have happened. And for example, he was in New Orleans when Katrina happened, and he did a whole body of work on Katrina. And for example, just as one example, my mother has a frying pan hanging in her living room, and on the frying pan there's a photograph of a woman in anguish, desperate. He used plastic bottles, empty plastic bottles, as a symbol for the water that people didn't get. He went to Goodwill and he got a whole bunch of 200 stuffed animals and worked with the stuffed animals in constructions. He He uses a lot of found objects, and with the same confidence that he approaches his painting. So I encourage you to just go online. He's so well documented and written about, and he really has a presence, and his work is tremendous in terms.
I guess part of that question was,
Mhm.
which I didn't state, was his work celebrated more in a particular medium? Did he find more celebration of his work, say in the oil or the mixed medium, or was it just across the board?
Well, I mean, at this point, he's an established, there's no question of his place, he tells us that once his work was celebrated, once his work of the 70s and even the 80s was accepted, he went in a different direction because it was accepted. He talks about that need to change. But at the same time, you can recognize his work on a slide quiz. It's signature Azaceta. You can see the threads in whatever medium he's working in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The last slide that talked about freedom, I couldn't help but notice it looked like it was full of buttons, almost like he's come full circle from one of his very early jobs as a new exile.
Right.
Is that...
but this is...
I think it's like this, maybe with certain humor.
Sorry.
Is that intentional, or am I reading more into it?
He keeps coming full circle. I mean, this is 1993. He's made so much work since then, but he does work in cycles, and it's so much fun studying his body of work because you see all these relationships. He was looking for. He took his time. He moved out of hard edge minimalism. He was looking for his own voice in art, his own iconography, but he was going to take his time, and he's taken a lifetime. And you see all of those relationships from work to work. You see here the tracks, the tower-like images in the background that appear even in He Express in the windows. The red, white, and blue it's a flag, it's pop, it's flag, might make you think of Jasper Johns, pop even in 93, but it's both America and Cuba, that marriage. Yeah. The buttons aren't, when I interviewed him in 2004, I mentioned the buttons, and they were like, oh my God. I heard Sharon said, you're good. We hadn't thought of that. So, yeah, other questions, comments? Okay. Well, thank you so much for your attention.